January 2025. The U.S. Senate doesn't just sanction Uganda's future dictator. They move to arrest him. General Muhoozi, President Museveni's son, the man being groomed to inherit 40 years of power, is now facing Global Magnitsky charges. But here's where it gets insane. North Korea, yes, North Korea, issues a statement defending Uganda. Then Burkina Faso's Captain Traoré drops a question that shatters everything. Where were you for 4 decades? Suddenly, this isn't about one arrest. It's about which superpower controls Africa's next generation of leaders. And the answer? It's no longer obvious. What happens in the next 18 months will rewrite the continent's future permanently. In the final days of January 2025, the United States Senate moved to impose global Magnitsky sanctions on General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, son of Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni and heir apparent to 4 decades of uninterrupted rule. The same resolution explored mechanisms for his arrest on charges tied to systematic brutality against opposition figures, including musician-turned-politician Bobi Wine and his family. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was Washington severing ties with a dynasty it had protected, funded, and diplomatically shielded since 1986. The question isn't why this happened. The question is why it took this long, and why now, when the regime's grip appears weakest, did the world finally decide to act? For anyone watching African geopolitics, this moment carries weight far beyond Kampala. It represents the collapse of a foundational compact that has governed Western engagement with authoritarian allies across the continent. Strategic value in exchange for political silence. Uganda under Museveni provided military muscle in Somalia, intelligence cooperation on counterterrorism, and regional stability in the Great Lakes. In return, Washington looked the other way as elections were rigged, dissidents disappeared, and a military general with no electoral mandate positioned himself to inherit a nation. That deal is now broken, and the fallout is rippling across capitals, from Ouagadougou to Pyongyang, in ways that reveal just how fragile the old order has become. The sanctions push didn't emerge in a vacuum. It followed months of escalating violence against Bobi Wine, whose national unity platform has become the most serious electoral threat to Museveni's rule in a generation. Wine's rallies have been violently dispersed. His supporters have been abducted. His own family has faced harassment and intimidation that crosses every threshold of political decency. In November 2024, security forces stormed his home in what authorities described as a law enforcement operation. What unfolded was a televised siege that exposed the regime's reliance on raw coercion over any pretense of democratic legitimacy. The images circulated globally. Western embassies issued statements. And within weeks, senators in Washington began drafting measures that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. General Muhoozi himself became the focal point not only because of his direct command over units implicated in these crackdowns, but because of what he represents. He is the embodiment of dynastic succession in a country where constitutional term limits were erased to keep his father in power. He holds no elected office, yet wields authority that supersedes cabinet ministers. He tweets policy provocations that unsettle regional allies and embarrass diplomats. He is both the regime's enforcer and its most visible liability. Targeting him with sanctions and potential arrest sends a message not just to Uganda, but to every aging autocrat on the continent grooming a successor. The world is no longer willing to pretend this is normal governance. But here's where the story shifts from a bilateral diplomatic crisis into something far more complex. As the Senate resolution gained momentum, the international response began to fracture in unexpected directions. North Korea, a nation with virtually no direct stake in East African affairs, issued a statement condemning what it called Western interference in Uganda's sovereignty. Pyongyang framed the sanctions as part of a broader imperialist assault on nations that refuse to submit to Anglo-American hegemony. The statement was unusual not just in its existence, but in its timing and tone. It aligned North Korea publicly with an African government facing diplomatic isolation, signaling a willingness to position itself as a defender of embattled regimes resisting Western pressure. This is a geopolitical alignment that makes little sense in traditional terms, but perfect sense in the emerging architecture of resistance to U.S. influence. Then came Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 35-year-old leader of Burkina Faso, who seized power in a 2022 coup and has since become one of Africa's most outspoken critics of Western dominance, delivered a response that resonated far beyond his borders. Traoré didn't defend Museveni's human rights record. He didn't praise the regime's governance. Instead, he asked the question that cut to the heart of the hypocrisy. Where was this righteous concern for 4 decades? Where were the sanctions when Museveni dissolved term limits in 2005? Where was the arrest warrant when opposition leaders were tortured in the early 2000s? Where was the moral outrage when his security forces massacred protesters in 2009, 2011, and 2016? Traoré's answer was clear. The West didn't care about repression. It cared about control. And the moment Uganda's value as a compliant partner began to wane, the moment the succession looked messy and the regime appeared vulnerable, suddenly the language of justice and accountability flooded diplomatic cables. This reframing matters because it shifts the narrative from one of belated Western accountability to one of geopolitical opportunism. Traoré is arguing that the sanctions aren't about Bobi Wine or human rights. They're about regime change disguised as justice. They're about destabilizing a government that has outlived its usefulness and replacing it with something more pliable, more aligned with shifting American priorities in East Africa. Whether or not that interpretation is entirely accurate is almost beside the point. What matters is that it resonates across Francophone West Africa, across the Sahel, and increasingly across the continent. There is a deep well of skepticism about Western interventions cloaked in the language of democracy and rights. Traoré tapped into that skepticism with surgical precision, and he wasn't alone. Social media across Africa lit up with similar critiques. Hashtags questioning the timing and motives of the sanctions trended in multiple languages. Pan-Africanist commentators pointed to decades of U.S. military aid to Uganda despite well-documented abuses. Regional analysts noted that American concern for democratic norms seemed curiously selective, robust when applied to adversaries or weakened allies, but muted when it came to stable partners like Rwanda or Egypt. The narrative that Washington was acting out of genuine concern for Ugandan democracy struggled to gain traction in a continent that has watched this playbook before. But there's another layer here that complicates the simple anti-imperialist reading. Bobi Wine is not a Western puppet. His movement is organic, rooted in youth frustration, economic stagnation, and decades of authoritarian stagnation. His supporters are not calling for American intervention. They're calling for free and fair elections. They're demanding the right to choose their leaders without facing state violence. The fact that Washington's belated support happens to align with their struggle doesn't delegitimize their cause. It does, however, create a politically toxic association that the regime will exploit ruthlessly. Museveni's government has already begun framing wine as a tool of foreign destabilization, a narrative that gains credibility precisely because of the Senate's timing. This is where the geopolitical stakes become clear. Uganda sits at the crossroads of multiple strategic theaters. It contributes the largest contingent to the African Union mission in Somalia, a force backed by American funding and logistics. It shares a volatile border with the Democratic Republic of Congo, where rival militias, mineral wealth, and great power competition create a security environment that Washington monitors closely. It has Rwishru allies served as a counterweight to Kenya's regional ambitions and a check on South Sudan's instability. Losing Uganda as a reliable partner doesn't just affect bilateral relations. It reshapes the entire security architecture of East Africa. And Museveni knows this. His regime has survived for nearly 40 years not because of popularity, but because of strategic indispensability. He has positioned Uganda as the go-to ally for Western counter-terrorism operations, the stable anchor in a turbulent region. But that indispensability is eroding. Somalia's security situation remains dire despite years of intervention. Regional partners are diversifying their alliances. And Museveni's age, now 80, raises questions about succession stability regardless of who inherits power. The Senate sanctions are a signal that Washington is beginning to hedge its bets, preparing for a post-Museveni Uganda, and willing to pressure the transition rather than passively accept dynastic continuity. General Muhoozi's response to the sanctions was characteristically defiant. He took to social media to mock the resolution, framing it as evidence of Western decline and desperation. He positioned himself as a nationalist, standing firm against external interference. He invoked Pan-African solidarity and anti-colonial rhetoric. But beneath the bluster, there are signs of real concern. The sanctions threaten not just his personal finances, but his international mobility and the financial networks that sustain elite patronage. If implemented fully, Global Magnitsky measures freeze assets, ban travel, and create cascading secondary sanctions on anyone doing business with designated individuals. For a figure whose power depends on maintaining patronage networks and projecting invincibility, this is a serious blow. The possibility of an arrest warrant adds another dimension. Unlike sanctions, which are primarily financial and diplomatic, an arrest order creates physical risk. It limits travel to non-aligned nations. It forces reliance on countries willing to defy international legal mechanisms, a club that grows smaller each year. It turns every foreign trip into a potential extradition scenario. For someone like Muhoozi, who has cultivated an image as a sophisticated, globally connected military leader, this is a reputational and operational disaster. It signals that the path to power his father carved out, the assumption that loyalty to Western partners guaranteed protection, no longer holds. But here's the complication. If the sanctions and arrest mechanisms succeed in sidelining Muhoozi, what comes next? Uganda's political landscape is not a simple binary between dictatorship and democracy. It's a complex ecosystem of military factions, ethnic patronage networks, business elites, and regional power brokers, all held together by Museveni's personal authority. Remove the heir apparent without a clear transition plan, and the result isn't necessarily democracy. It could be factional conflict, military fragmentation, or the rise of an even more repressive figure willing to crack down harder to consolidate control. The history of transitions in Africa is littered with examples where the collapse of one authoritarian system led not to pluralism, but to chaos or another form of autocracy. This is the calculation that Traoré and others are pointing to when they question Western motives. They're arguing that destabilizing Museveni without a coherent plan for what follows risks triggering the very instability that Washington claims to want to prevent. And they're suggesting that this instability might be the point, that a weakened, fractured Uganda serves certain geopolitical interests better than a stable, independent one. Whether that's true or not, the fact that the argument resonates tells you something about the depth of mistrust between African governments and Western powers. Meanwhile, the 2026 elections loom. Museveni has already announced he will run again, a move that surprises no one but clarifies the regime's intentions. There will be no graceful exit, no negotiated transition. The plan is to hold power until death or incapacity, and then transfer it to Muhoozi under the fiction of constitutional process. But that plan now faces unprecedented pressure. The sanctions create fractures within the elite coalition that sustains the regime. They embolden opposition forces who see international support as validation. They signal to younger military officers that the dynasty is vulnerable, that alternatives exist. In short, they introduce uncertainty into a system that has survived by eliminating uncertainty through force. Bobi Wine, for his part, has welcomed the sanctions while carefully distancing himself from claims of foreign manipulation. He has framed the measures as a natural consequence of regime brutality, not a Western plot. He has called for free elections, international observers, and an end to political violence. His messaging is disciplined, aimed at maintaining legitimacy both domestically and internationally. But he faces an impossible balance. Accepting Western support risks, confirming regime propaganda. Rejecting it risks losing crucial diplomatic leverage. Every statement is scrutinized for signs of alignment or independence, and the regime's propaganda machine is ready to weaponize any misstep. The regional response has been telling. Kenya, Uganda's neighbor and sometime rival, has remained conspicuously silent. Nairobi has no interest in destabilizing a country with which it shares deep economic and security ties, but it also has no desire to publicly defend Museveni's human rights record. Tanzania, historically cautious in regional disputes, has offered bland statements about sovereignty and non-interference. Rwanda, under Paul Kagame, has said nothing at all, a silence that speaks volumes given Kigali's own fraught relationship with Western criticism and its complex, often hostile, interactions with Kampala. The lack of regional solidarity is striking. It suggests that Museveni's neighbors are hedging, preparing for multiple scenarios, unwilling to tie their fortunes to a regime that looks increasingly brittle. Then there's the China variable. Beijing has invested heavily in Ugandan infrastructure, from roads to energy projects. It has cultivated close ties with Museveni's government as part of its broader Belt and Road strategy in East Africa. The sanctions create an opening for China to deepen that relationship, offering financial support and diplomatic cover in exchange for greater influence. But China has also shown caution in backing regimes facing internal instability. Beijing's priority is economic access and strategic positioning, not ideological solidarity with embattled autocrats. If the Museveni regime looks like a losing bet, China will quietly distance itself, maintaining relationships with all potential successors. The sanctions test how much Beijing is willing to invest in a partnership that carries growing reputational and financial risk. Russia, too, factors into this equation. Moscow has been expanding its footprint across Africa, particularly in countries where Western influence is waning. Uganda is not a priority theater for Russian engagement, but the sanctions create an opportunity. If Kampala feels isolated, if the elite coalition fears asset freezes and travel bans, Russia can offer alternative banking channels, arms supplies, and diplomatic support. This is how geopolitical realignments happen, not through grand strategy, but through incremental shifts driven by immediate crises. The Senate sanctions might have been intended to pressure democratic reform, but they could just as easily push Uganda deeper into the orbit of powers with no interest in democracy at all. What North Korea's statement reveals is the emergence of a loose, opportunistic coalition of states willing to publicly challenge U.S. geopolitical dominance. These aren't formal alliances. They're tactical alignments based on shared grievances and mutual benefit. Pyongyang gains nothing material from defending Museveni, but it gains symbolic capital as a voice of resistance to Western interference. It signals to other embattled regimes that alternatives exist, that isolation isn't inevitable. This is soft power projection by a country with virtually no hard power to deploy in Africa, and it works precisely because the narrative resonates. Traoré's Burkina Faso represents a different model. Unlike North Korea, Burkina Faso is deeply embedded in regional and continental politics. Traoré has positioned himself as a leader of a new generation of African governance, one that rejects both the old autocrats and the neoliberal frameworks imposed by Western financial institutions. His criticism of the Uganda sanctions is part of a broader critique of what he sees as selective, hypocritical Western engagement. He's building a constituency across Francophone Africa and beyond, one that views sovereignty and self-determination as non-negotiable, even when regimes are flawed. This is not a defense of dictatorship. It's a rejection of the idea that the West has the right to determine which governments are legitimate and which are not. And that rejection is spreading. Across the Sahel, military governments that came to power through coups have expelled French forces, demanded renegotiation of security agreements, and explored partnerships with Russia and others. They're framing their actions not as anti-democratic, but as anti-colonial, as the reclamation of sovereignty from powers that treated them as subordinates. The Uganda sanctions fit neatly into this narrative. They're seen as another example of Western powers punishing governments that stray from the approved script, regardless of the actual human rights situation on the ground. But here's the paradox. While regional leaders question Western motives, ordinary Ugandans facing state violence don't have the luxury of geopolitical theory. They need the brutality to stop. They need space to organize, to vote, to speak without fear. Whether the sanctions are motivated by genuine concern or strategic opportunism doesn't change the fact that international pressure can create openings for domestic change. The challenge is ensuring that those openings lead to meaningful reform rather than factional conflict or deeper oppression. The regime's reliance on force rather than legitimacy is accelerating. In recent months, security forces have intensified operations against opposition strongholds, particularly in urban areas where Wine support is strongest. Arrests have increased, surveillance has expanded, the space for independent media has shrunk further. This is the behavior of a government that knows it cannot win a free election and has decided that survival depends on making such an election impossible. Every crackdown hardens opposition resolve, but it also demonstrates the regime's willingness to pay any cost to maintain power. This is not a government preparing for transition. This is a government preparing for war against its own people. The economic dimension cannot be ignored. Uganda's economy has stagnated under decades of corruption and mismanagement. Youth unemployment is staggering. Infrastructure projects benefit elites, while basic services deteriorate. Oil revenues, long promised as a transformative windfall, remain mostly hypothetical, delayed by regulatory disputes and infrastructure gaps. The sanctions threaten to worsen this situation by deterring investment and complicating financial transactions. But they also create pressure on the elite coalition, forcing business leaders and military officers to calculate whether loyalty to the dynasty is worth economic isolation. This is where sanctions can be effective, not by immediately toppling regimes, but by creating internal fractures that make continuation of the status quo untenable. What happens next could redefine the region. If the sanctions succeed in forcing political opening, Uganda could become a rare example of externally supported democratic transition in a region where such transitions are vanishingly rare. If they fail, if the regime digs in and survives through repression and alternative alliances, it will embolden other autocrats facing similar pressure and validate the narrative that Western democracy promotion is ineffective posturing. If they trigger instability without a clear path to reform, they will confirm every criticism Traoré and others have leveled about reckless Western intervention. The stakes, in other words, extend far beyond Kampala. For Bobi Wine and the opposition, the road ahead is treacherous. They must maintain momentum without being delegitimized as foreign proxies. They must organize under conditions of severe repression. They must prepare for elections that will almost certainly be rigged, while also preparing for the possibility that the regime will cancel elections altogether rather than risk losing. They must build coalitions across ethnic and regional divides in a country where identity politics have been weaponized for decades. And they must do all of this while the international community watches with a mixture of hope, skepticism, and strategic calculation. The Museveni era is ending. The only question is how. A managed transition that preserves elite interests while opening limited political space. A violent crackdown that destroys the opposition but leaves the country ungovernable. A factional split within the military that triggers civil conflict. An election so blatantly fraudulent that it ignites mass protests the regime cannot contain. Each scenario is plausible. Each carries profound implications not just for Uganda, but for every country watching to see whether 4 decades of entrenched power can be challenged, and what it costs to try. The involvement of actors like North Korea and voices like Traoré reveal that this is no longer a simple story of dictatorship versus democracy. It's a contest over who gets to define legitimacy, who has the authority to judge governance, and what the international order will tolerate going forward. The post-Cold War consensus that democracy promotion and human rights were universal values enforced by Western-led institutions is collapsing. In its place, a more fragmented, contested system is emerging, where sovereignty is asserted more aggressively, where alternative partnerships are more viable, and where the language of anti-imperialism carries real political weight. Uganda is a test case, not the first, but one of the most consequential. because it challenges a relationship that endured for so long and seemed so stable. If Washington can turn on Museveni after 40 years, no authoritarian ally is truly secure. If sanctions and arrest warrants can target a general groomed for succession, dynastic ambitions everywhere are vulnerable. But if the regime survives, if it weathers this storm through repression and alternative alliances, it proves that the tools of Western pressure are losing their effectiveness, that defiance is viable, that the old rules no longer bind. The 2026 elections are not just a domestic event. They are a geopolitical inflection point. The world is watching to see whether a movement born in the streets of Kampala can overcome a military apparatus built to crush dissent. Whether international pressure can create space for change or whether it backfires, driving regimes into the arms of powers with no interest in democracy. Whether Africa's youngest generation, frustrated and mobilized, can translate that energy into political transformation, or whether they will be met with the same violence that has silenced previous challenges. This is the moment when inherited power, silent complicity, and the assumption that strategic value outweighs democratic accountability all face unprecedented resistance. The outcome is uncertain, the process will be brutal, and the implications will ripple across a continent where the old certainties are dying, and what comes next remains dangerously unwritten.